Welcome back to this week's episode of Mighty York. Adam and I are really excited about this episode because it's about, first of all, a person, but also a place that has captured the imagination of Torontonians for over 100 years. It's a place that, for me, has quite a significance because, first of all, it was really cool to go there as a child. But second of all, there was a children's book that always just captured my imagination. It was about this boy named John Tommy Fittich, who was always down on his luck. He couldn't get anything going, but one day he hears a notice for a rich Torontonian named Sir Henry Pellatt looking to add stones to his new wall that he's building. Now, he was looking for dingy stones, and John Tommy Fittich was like, you know what? I have a bunch of these stones in my garden. He found the perfect stone. It was dingy. It was gross, and he picked it up and he started bringing it to Henry Pellatt to get paid for his stones. As he was walking, his misfortune hits and it starts raining. The rain ultimately takes off the soot from the stone, revealing that it's not a black dingy stone, it's a white stone. He's upset, obviously, because he thinks that Henry Pellatt only wants dingy stones. What does he do? He tells a gardener outside of this big mansion that's being built about his situation. The gardener in turn decides to buy it anyways and says that the owner of the house would appreciate the stone. The gardener turns out actually to be Sir Henry Pellatt himself, and whether you believe the story or believe the rumors at all, you can see the white stone in the wall of Casa Loma. So enjoy this episode, guys.
This week's episode is about Major General Sir Henry Pellatt and the castle he built on Davenport Hill, namely Casa Loma. Casa Loma is one of the most distinctive buildings in Toronto, but first we're going to talk about the man who built it. Henry Pellatt was born in Kingston in 1859, but he moved to Toronto at the age of 2. He came from an upper-class family. His father was the first president of the Toronto Stock Exchange, and he could trace his British roots back to 1230. And that sort of thing used to be very important. Like any good upper-class Torontonian, he went to Upper Canada College and married an equally rich graduate of the elite Bishop Strachan School. Now, Henry wasn't much of a student, and he left school early to work at his father's brokerage house. He invested heavily in the Canada Northwest Land Company and made a fortune distributing land to veterans of the Northwest Rebellion. However, Pellatt's most important investment was electricity. In 1882, he was a founding member of the Toronto Electric Light Company, which produced electricity from a steam-driven power plant right behind the current location of Meridian Theatre. The company's first contract was to provide 32 arc lights to replace the oil and kerosene lamps used for street lighting. A few years later, it won the right to lay underground power cables, and by 1892, it was supplying power for Toronto's streetcars. Pellatt also financed the construction of the Toronto Power Generating Station at Niagara Falls. It took 3 years to finish the plant and to build the transmission wires from Niagara to the city. But by 1906, electricity generated by the falls was being used to power homes and businesses in Toronto.
Henry Pellatt was the consummate wheeler dealer. Here's just a list of some of the companies he invested in. The Crow's Nest Pass Coal Company, the Dunlop Pneumatic Tire Company of Australasia, Dominion Telegraph, Canadian Lake and Ocean Navigation, the British Columbia Packers Association, the Grand Trunk Pacific Railway, Standard Chemical, Iron and Lumber, the Dominion Securities Corporation, Arena Gardens of Toronto, the Cobalt Lake Mining Company, and Manufacturers Life Insurance. Not all of these investments were benign, and Pellatt was very much a robber baron. He lied to investors, creditors, and the directors of his companies. He manipulated stock prices and awarded himself thousands of shares as brokerage fees or promotional stock. A royal commission investigating the life insurance industry found that he invested company funds in firms that he owned, often without authorization. He also borrowed from the company to cover personal losses. These actions were described as barely legal. Many of his companies also had a bad record when it came to safety and accidents. There would be worse to come. But in the meantime, Henry Pellatt did all the things that an upper-class Torontonian was supposed to do in his spare time. He became president of the Woodbine Cricket Club. He was the Commodore of the Royal Toronto Sailing Club and a director of the Toronto Conservatory of Music. But his main project was the Queen's Own Rifles. The Queen's Own Rifles was a militia unit. Pellatt joined when he was 17. During the 50 years that he was connected with the regiment, the only active service he ever saw was when the militia was called out to quell a protest by striking railway workers in Belleville. Despite this lack of action, or maybe because of it, Pellatt loved military pageantry and spent lavish sums of his own money on the regiment. In 1902, Pellatt was appointed to command the Canadian contingent of the coronation of Edward VII, and decided to bring an entire military band at his own expense. In 1910, he paid out of his own pocket to send Queen's Own Rifles to England to participate in military maneuvers. All of this flamboyance got him the attention that he wanted. He would eventually be promoted all the way to Major General. He was knighted. George V named him Commander of the Victorian Order, and he became Knight Errant of the Imperial Society of Knights Bachelor, which, apparently, is a thing.
Henry Pellatt loved spending money, and he loved getting attention. His next project was designed to do both. In 1903, Pellatt bought 25 lots on the escarpment just north of Davenport Road, at what was then the northern outskirts of Toronto. His original plan had been to subdivide the land for a real estate development, but he had a grander idea. He wanted a home befitting what he saw as his status in society. He wanted the biggest residence in Canada. So, in 1911, construction began on Casa Loma. Casa Loma means house on the hill in Spanish. The mansion was designed by E.J. Lennox, the man who also designed the King Edward Hotel and Old City Hall. It wasn't meant to be new or modern. Instead, it was inspired by European castles, mansions, and hunting lodges. The official name for this style is Edwardian Revival, and Pellatt imported artisans from all over Europe to work on the building. Architects hated it. One critic called it a mixture of 17th century Scotch baronial and 20th century fox. High society also looked down its nose on the project. George Dennison was an old money descendant of the family compact, and he said, "Parvenus are as plentiful as blackberries, and the vulgar ostentation of the common rich is not a pleasant sight. Tut tut." Pellatt didn't care. He said that Casa Loma was intended for a spectacle. It had 98 rooms, 25 fireplaces, a library with enough space for 10,000 books, its own telephone system, the first elevator ever built in a private home, a pipe organ, and a kitchen range big enough to cook an ox. That's not a figure of speech. It's actually that big. There are stables, a massive garden, and a 2-story hunting lodge with servants' quarters. It also has 2 secret passageways, which I thought was incredible when I was a kid, one leading to the 2nd floor, and another leading from Pellatt's office to his underground safe, and then to an 800-foot tunnel to the stables. Pellatt built the tunnel because the city, rudely, refused to close traffic on the public street separating the stables from the main building. Incidentally, those stables have floors made of Spanish tile that is specifically designed to provide good grip for hooves. Construction took 3 years, 299 workers, and the total cost was $3.5 million, worth roughly $75 million today.
Pellatt loved hosting events at his new mansion. 3,000 guests attended one of his famous parties. He would also host the entire companies of the Queen's Own Rifles, with up to 1,000 men quartered in the basement, while the officers slept in the suites upstairs. So, what happened next? Pellatt's fortunes began to turn. The first blow came when a new provincial government endorsed a public ownership of hydroelectricity. Pellatt and his partners denounced these plans as socialism, but over the next 20 years, the Ontario government would take over all of Pellatt's electrical assets. These would become the foundations of Ontario Hydro. In the same year that Casa Loma was completed, World War I began, and Pellatt's flamboyant style and conspicuous consumption were seen as inappropriate at a time where men were fighting and dying in the trenches. He was also accused of being a wartime profiteer. Things got worse after the war ended. Pellatt seemed to have lost his business touch, and several of the companies that he was managing floundered. One business reporter wrote, "He isn't a financial genius and never was. One questions if anything in the way of an accurate estimate of him could be made." Casa Loma added to his financial problems. Beyond the cost of building it, the annual fuel bill was $15,000 a year, and a servant's payroll would reach $22,000. During this period, the city changed how property taxes were calculated, and Pellatt's bill jumped from $630 a year to $1,000 a month. Pellatt had been fighting the city over electricity management, so this move was very popular with council. Pellatt was eager to borrow money to invest in this or that scheme, and by 1923, he owed more than $4.5 million to the Home Bank. The Home Bank was run by a couple of buddies from the Queen's Own Rifles, and they happily loaned him cash. When the bank ran into trouble, they tried to call in Pellatt's loans, but he couldn't pay. They also discovered that he had been using accounting tricks to overvalue the collateral for his loans. First, a company that he owned would buy a piece of property. Then, he would buy that property from himself at a higher price. This gave it a higher value on paper, but not in reality. On Sunday in August, the Home Bank closed and took the life savings of 60,000 people with it.
Pellatt had transferred ownership of Casa Loma to his wife to try to prevent its seizure, but they still couldn't afford to live there. Pellatt and his wife were forced to move out, and his wife died shortly thereafter. Casa Loma's furnishings were put up for sale. Pellatt had reportedly spent $1.5 million acquiring them, but they only brought in $250,000 at auction. One buyer, a Mr. Gorman, purchased a 1,500-pound bronze buffalo head for $50 because he thought it would make a funny gift. Mr. Gorman is my kind of guy. Someone else came away with a carved marble fountain of children supporting a dolphin. A grandfather clock went for $155. A collection of garden vases was scooped up for $16 each. And 2 brass sundials were bought by a man from Detroit for $25. The $75,000 pipe organ went for all of $40, and only after the auctioneer played a rendition of Auld Lang Syne. The auctioneer also tried to convince buyers to bid on some of the pieces by warning, and this would be the worst of all fates, that the artwork would go to Montreal if they didn't. You can find a picture of the auction that we posted online. Henry Pellatt still got attention. He had an audience with the Prince of Wales in 1924, but he was financially ruined. He still had significant assets, but they were all controlled by a trustee managing the liquidation of the Home Bank. He tried to make money with speculation schemes and assorted corporate maneuverings. Whatever money he got his hands on was spent or mismanaged. He was forced to move into smaller and smaller apartments, and he finally wound up living in a room at his former chauffeur's home in Mimico. When he died in 1939, he received a full military funeral at St. James Cathedral.
As for Casa Loma, for the first 10 years after he moved out, it was still in his wife's name, and Pellatt had different ideas of what to do with it. In 1927, he tried to convert it into a luxury hotel. You could stay there for $6 a night, which was a lot of money in those days. But the hotel quickly ran into financial trouble. New managers tried converting part of the building into a nightclub, but it didn't work. Guests would be given 1 day to move out when the doors finally closed in 1928. However, the nightclub left one lasting legacy. The house band started calling themselves the Casa Loma Orchestra. After the hotel closed, the band moved to New York and became one of the first successful swing groups. The band's first hit was called the Casa Loma Stomp. And we're going to play a little bit for you right now. Okay, that was pretty good. One writer said, that it sounded a little like something like a Toronto militia band might have invented it if it had suddenly learned how to swing. In 1929, Pellatt signed a deal to convert Casa Loma into luxury apartments, but the stock market crashed later that year and his plan fell apart. By 1934, Casa Loma's unpaid tax bill had reached $27,000 and the city seized the property. What to do with Casa Loma became something of a parlor game. Some of the mainstream suggestions were converting it into a railway station, a hospital, a high school, an art gallery, and a veterans home. Other people suggested making it a residence for the Pope, the King, or the Dion quintuplets. Movie star and Toronto native Mary Pickford wanted to shoot a historical movie there. There was even talk about just tearing the whole thing down, but that would have been even more expensive. Finally, the city signed a deal to let the Kiwanis Club operate it as a tourist attraction. Kiwanis members volunteered to clean out a decade's worth of cobwebs, trash, animal nests, and in May 1937, Casa Loma opened its door to the public. For 25 cents, you can wander through the castle, climb the tower, slip through the secret passages, and stroll through the gardens. It's a little bit more expensive today, though.
Just recently, we learned that during World War II, the stables at Casa Loma were used to conceal a secret lab developing an early form of sonar to detect German U-boats. The lab was originally based in London, but it had been bombed during the Blitz, and one of the top people figured that German intelligence would never think to look for a top-secret lab at a popular tourist attraction. Tourists wandered past signs saying that the stables were under construction, and never knew that military research was taking place less than 100 feet away. Kiwanis continued to run Casa Loma until 2011. Over time, there had been complaints that Kiwanis was allowing the building to become run down. For their part, Kiwanis said that it didn't have the money to pay for all the necessary renovations. The city finally revoked their lease because the club was using revenue to cover operational shortfalls instead of paying for building improvements. In 2014, the city signed a long-term lease with Liberty Entertainment Group, which agreed to spend $7.4 million to upgrade the building. So, what is Casa Loma used for today? Tours are available on most days. You can also book rooms for different events. Hundreds of weddings and corporate events are held there every year. It's a popular film location. X-Men, Chicago, and Scott Pilgrim vs. the World are some of the movies that were shot there. It also hosts assorted concerts and plays throughout the year. More recently, parts of the building have been converted into escape rooms.
And that's our episode. Thank you so much for tuning in, guys. We love having you. As always, we try to do our best research, but if we miss something, please let us know. We're just trying to make this podcast as good as possible. You can find us on Twitter as Toronto_history or email us at muddy_york@outlook.com. Thanks again for tuning in. Make sure to share this with your friends. Give us a review. Give us those stars that we're looking for. Thank you so much, guys. Have a great day.